So the parsonage was full on Thanksgiving Day. People from 6 different states traveled to eat lunch at my table. It was amazing. As lunch was starting, I asked my wife, Chan, to pass me the salt. But I didn't realize that my mom was standing right behind me. She was in my blind spot at the sweet potato casserole. Mom knows that I carry a salt and pepper shaker in my truck. You know, you never know when a random order of mashed potatoes might need a little help. So as she sat down beside me, I got yet another warning about how too much salt is not good, and the impact on my health is not a good thing. God talks about the impact of salt. We've been following these weeks in our commitment series, Something in the Water, this vision that God gives Ezekiel where water actually flows from the front of the temple and it becomes a river and it goes into the sea of stagnant waters, or the Dead Sea. It goes through the wilderness. 2 times the story says that wherever this river goes, everything will live. Everything comes alive. So on the banks of this river are fruit trees that always have fruit. There's always food. Leaves are for healing. There's fish of every kind. Verse 11 is curious, though, where God says to Ezekiel, its swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They are to be left for salt. In Jesus' sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, he talks about salt. In fact, he says that we are the salt. You are the salt of the earth. So we become the salt that's in the water. Salt is worthless if it's not salty. And that's one of the things that Jesus says. The salt has to have the power to wake up my food with awesomeness, you know. The salt has to have the power to preserve and to hold back the decay. Salt has to have the power to melt the ice. I think that in part what Jesus is saying is a call to holiness. For us to be full of salt or salty is a call to heart purity. It's a reminder that the river comes from a sacred place, that stagnant places become fresh, dead places come alive, fruit trees never stop bearing fruit for food, the leaves have the power to heal, because this water flows from the sanctuary. That's our commitment to prayer and to presence. To position ourselves in a place where God can mess with us, where confession can happen, where transformation becomes a reality, where you and I are changed and we're different. Salt is also worthless if it stays in the shaker. It has to leave the shaker. It has to touch the potatoes. The water leaves the temple and flows into barren places. And Jesus did that. He looked for people who were far from God, because Jesus knows that people matter to God. And there's good news in that for us, that we matter to God, regardless of who we are. Luke tells us a story about Jesus once when Jesus was passing through Jericho. He was just passing through Jericho. He wasn't staying. His face was set to Jerusalem. He was on his way to Jerusalem, and he was just going through. And he meets a man by the name of Zacchaeus. If you're like me, and grew up in the church, you know about Zacchaeus. At least you know the songs. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he, and he climbed up into the sycamore tree because he wanted to see Jesus. Well, Luke tells us that Zacchaeus was rich, and that he was a chief tax collector. And that's kind of all that he says about him. But that's all he needed to say for those who would have been hearing his story or reading it, because they understood immediately what that meant. If he was a chief tax collector, then he collected taxes for the Romans, and if he was rich, then it meant he collected enough extra for himself that put him in a nice position. And so you can imagine the resentment that comes from a situation like that. Also, in the Jewish faith community, he would have been considered unclean for handling the foreign money, and so not really a likable guy. Probably a lot of scorn. He wasn't invited to too many parties. I'm thinking that he was quite isolated. Maybe not friendless, but his list of friends would have been small. And so Jesus stops at the sycamore tree, and he looks up at Zacchaeus, and he doesn't say, "Zacchaeus, you lying, dirty little thief, come down from that tree and stop doing that stuff." It wasn't a rebuke like that at all. I think it's because Jesus knew Zacchaeus' heart. I think Zacchaeus climbed the tree in the first place because he heard the rumors about Jesus, that he was a friend to people like him. And Jesus didn't disappoint, because Jesus says, "Come down from that tree because I'm coming to your house." He invited himself to dinner and spent the day with him. An important thing to note, I think, for today is that wasn't Jesus' plan. He changed his agenda, and he lingered. And it made all the difference in the life of one person. He was criticized for stuff like this, for befriending those people that would have been on the fringes, for befriending those people that would have been considered an outcast or a sinner or an unworthy person, an unclean person. And that happens again in this story with Zacchaeus. And Jesus' response to them was, "The Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." Dale Galloway was the dean of the Beeson program at Asbury Theological Seminary, and he stood in front of our class and he told his story. He told about his bitter divorce, and that because of that divorce, his ministry was in jeopardy. Because of his denomination, his options were now quite limited. And so he was at a very low point in his life, and so he was out on the beach. And he told us that God met him on the beach and that God affirmed him, but also affirmed his call to the ministry. And so he got up from the sand filled with new hope, and he decided that he wanted to go and start a new church in the most unchurched city in the nation. And so he did his research, and then that was Portland, Oregon. So Portland, Oregon was the most unchurched city in America, and so he just up and moved out there, and he started a new church, New Hope Church. And he started it in a drive-in theater. He was able to rent the drive-in theater on Sunday morning, and so people would come in their cars and they would attach the speaker to their window, and Dr. Galloway would stand on top of the concession stand to preach his sermon, and they would collect the offering in the popcorn buckets. And the church grew to 6,000 people. And he stood before our class, maybe with tears in his eyes, as he said, "If you don't have a passion to share the gospel with those who need it, you won't have vision that matches God's heart." That's what a commitment to being a witness is, I think, at the heart of it. And it makes us a little anxious and uneasy, because that's an evangelism thing. When someone asks you to share the gospel, half the time we don't even know what that means. And you do know what it means. It's just good news. Is it because of our experiences with evangelism have been awkward or unpleasant? Like if someone like me were to invite you, on Saturday I'm going at 9 in the morning to this neighborhood, and we're just going to knock on doors and share our faith with people who need it. I don't imagine that there would be a long line of you waiting to go with me. That's out of our comfort zone. And I want to be careful never to criticize that evangelism style just because it doesn't really fit with my style, because I know that there are people in the kingdom and who know God's love and grace because there were some courageous people who knocked on their door at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning. But I also think that most people probably don't want to see me on their doorstep to talk about something that increasingly is a personal matter, which is a conversation about faith. So what do? Well, Jesus made friends with people. I would say that there's a good chance that most of our friends are already Christian. At least I know that's easy. It's easy for me that my circles of friendship, it's the holy huddle, as some people call it. I'd also guess that there's a good chance that we don't have to look very far in those spaces that we inhabit to discover that there are some people who are maybe in a barren place spiritually. Maybe they feel like they're in this wilderness place, far away from God, or even far away from anything that's good. And Jesus sought people out like that. He went looking for them. And that's what I want to remind myself, that Jesus looked for people like this. And they weren't a project, they were a friend. And it's not all that hard, really. Like, you just go bowling. Just go bowling. Or have a cup of coffee. You fall in love with some people. But it's on purpose. Jesus says, I've come to seek out people who are lost. That's a declaration of purpose. This is why I've come. And I think for us to be faithful in our witnessing, it needs to be on purpose too. And I think for starters, we just pray for God to help. God, give me an opportunity. I did that, asking God to use me in Lithuania. Lithuania was having their first international marathon. And so since I was a missionary in Lithuania, I thought, well, I need to run this first marathon. That would be kind of neat. And so I began to train, but I was training all by myself, and I was running this race all by myself. And so at some point in the training, I began to pray, God, I'd like to meet a friend and run with someone in this race, and it might be an opportunity for me to talk about you, to kind of throw some salt out there. And so sure enough, we were 1 mile into this race, and all of a sudden I realized there's this young man running beside me. And I got so excited inside. Like this was earlier in the race than I expected, and so I discovered that he was a student there, a business student there in the capital city of Vilnius. And one of the things that runners will talk about is the types of shoes that you wear, or how long was your longest training run? Because, some experts will say if you train 18 miles, you'll be able to run the 26 miles in the race. And others will say, no, you got to do more than that. You need to run 22 miles. Or some will even argue you really can't be at your best unless you do a training run at 26 miles. But then if you do that, you got to recover. And, so there's this ongoing conversation. And so that's some of the stuff that we talk about. And so I said to him, what was your longest training run? And he kind of hem-hawed around about being busy and his schedule. And he says, well, I got up to 3 miles. And I knew immediately that the boundaries of our time together were going to be limited. Especially when he told me that he had just purchased his running shoes the day before. But I didn't want to be pressed. I wanted it just to be an authentic, natural conversation. At about mile 3, we encountered a steep hill, and halfway up the hill, I looked over and noticed that he was starting to turn green. When I got to the top of the hill, he was completely gone, and I looked back, and he was in the ditch losing breakfast. And I was disappointed for him, but also disappointed for the friendship that didn't happen. But several miles later, I started turning green, and so then the last thing on my mind was being a witness. I just wanted to survive. But it's a reminder that we need to be ready to share our story. That to be a witness means to speak it. Peter writes about that in his first letter. Always be ready to give an account of the hope that's in you. What's my hope? I was running with a friend in Asheville, and he's not very interested in church stuff. And while we were running once, he just asked right out of the blue, he said, Keith, you seem like a normal guy. Why do you want to be the pastor of a church? Why do you do that? Why would you want to do that? Those aren't always easy to answer. I trust that maybe from time to time you'll have people who ask you questions like that too. And it can be a bit scary to venture out into the swamp. But I don't have to be afraid to have a conversation about God, because when I really stop and think about it, I realize that I've actually got something to say. And I would guess that you do too. So that when a friend asks you what's behind some of your faith activity, like, well, why won't you play golf with me on Sunday morning? To go to church, to go to worship, to go to church. Why are you always doing stuff with your Sunday school class? And why are you always volunteering? Whatever those form that question might take. What do we say to that? Just think about what matters to you in all of those things. What I often say, and remember, I've been to seminary twice, is I will say, I don't really understand a lot of it. Because that's true. So much of our faith is mysterious. What we believe about who God is and what God does and what calls us to be. And if I'm going to be completely honest, I can say some things, but it's not all that easy to articulate. And so it's quite honest for me to just say, I'm not so sure. But what I am sure of is that when I go, I have very real experiences on Sunday morning. And I'm inspired. And I'm changed. And a lot of times when I leave, I feel like I'm different. And I feel like I'm better. And I believe it's because God's doing something. That doesn't sound too intellectual. But I've learned that's not really what people are after when they ask me sincere questions. And I can say, I have friends who care about me. And I can say, I don't know everything there is to know about God, but I do know that God cares about people, that people matter to God. And that's why I volunteer at Pathways and at the Open Door and with these kids on Wednesday afternoons. A witness speaks the truth, but it has to be authentic. A witness also lives the truth. Jesus says at the end of the passage, let your light shine. And he equates that with the stuff that we do. Let your light shine so they can see your good works and glorify God. I love what Jim Harnish says. He says, we don't need more salesmen for the gospel. The world needs more free samples. The program that I mentioned earlier that I was a part of, we traveled all over the country. And a part of that was visiting congregations and being in the same room with church leaders who were experiencing some kind of impact with their ministry and making a difference. A part of that year, we focused a lot on clarity of mission, like why does the church exist? And so there was, talk about having a mission statement and a vision statement, and that becomes kind of a trendy thing where that's a good thing, but we're wordsmithing the right mission statement. So, but that was kind of always at the forefront of things. And as we would go to these different places and visit these different churches, I would notice the mission statements and the vision statements. Surprisingly and wonderfully, how most of them were kind of the same, which just told me that maybe the Spirit's guiding us in this. But one of the churches that my wife Chan and I really enjoyed, and we ended up going there 6 times in the course of that year on our own, was the Cincinnati Vineyard in Ohio. Their vision statement grabbed me and inspired me. And so I wanted to share it with you. This is the Cincinnati Vineyard vision. Imagine a ragtag collection of surrendered and transformed people who love God and others. They are mesmerized by the idea that this is not about them, but all about Jesus. They're transfixed by his story and his heart for their city. They are seed throwers and fire starters, hope peddlers and grace givers, risk takers and dreamers, young and old. They link arms with anyone who tells the story of Jesus. They empower the poor, strengthen the weak, embrace the outcast, seek the lost. They serve together, play together, worship together, live life together. Their city will change because God sent them. And then they would say all the time, we believe that small things done with great love will change the world. So today is our last Sunday as we reflect on our commitments. What are those disciplines that define us? What is my life going to look like as it relates to my commitment to prayer? What is my life going to look like with my commitment to presence, God's presence, being in your presence, and so on? We're challenged to think about what our lives will look like with a commitment to being generous. What kind of gifts am I going to give? Am I going to give a financial gift, fill out a stewardship or a pledge card? Am I going to be committed to tithing? Am I going to be committed to that person that I meet on Tuesday afternoon at 3 o'clock that has a specific need? And is the gift of my life going to be engaged and come into play? What about serving? How am I going to be committed to use these gifts and abilities and passions that God has gifted me with? What is it going to look like for me to serve? And then today, am I going to have the courage to be a witness? Paul writes to the church in Colossians chapter 4, conduct yourselves wisely toward outsiders, making the most of the time. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt. Amen.